everyone, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's all dive right in to learn some Jewish history together. As we discussed in last week's session, at this point on the map of world history, going macro, Jewish history going micro, we now have the two offshoot cousins of Judaism controlling each essentially a third of the world. We got a third of the world is Christian, a third of the world is Muslim, and their struggles will continue to mount and to go back and forth, and will affect the Jewish people in different time periods, as we'll get into in the coming sessions. But for tonight, we want to focus on what the Babylonian community looks like at this time. So for this snapshot of the second part of the first millennium, this is the time period of the supremacy of Babylon. Babylon is clearly the Jewish community. Israel, as we said, is already unfortunately a thing of the past. And Babylon will be the center for the next 500 years. And it's those 500 years, for the most part, we really want to cover tonight, and what happens during those 500 years. Now, depending on which parts of Babylon we're talking about, there were several different major cities, Sura, Pumbedisa. But for the most part, at this point, the Persians are a thing of the past. They had controlled a lot of the area, and it's basically under Muslim rule, but as we'll see, for the most part, benevolent Muslim rule. The Jews are still allowed to thrive in the areas of Babylon, and the academies are able to thrive, the communities are able to thrive, and that's what will happen at least until roughly the year 1000. Now, as we've mentioned before, but we're going to really delve into in detail tonight, the breakdown of the Jewish community was interesting, because the Jewish community had a certain amount of provincial freedom within the caliphate, within the controlling Muslim region. And there were always two leaders of the Jewish people. There was like a chief rabbi that we refer to as a Gaon. Now, Gaon in Hebrew means genius. We have latter people referred to as a Gaon, like the Vilna Gaon that we'll get to. That's not what we're talking about now. We're now talking about a time period of Geonim. So if we go macro for a moment once again, and we talk about our different rabbis or rabbinical periods throughout Jewish history, we have the time of Moshe, we have the time of the prophets. Okay, then we segue from there into the time period of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah. Then we had the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara. Then we had that small period of the Savarim, the rabbis that really cleaned up the Talmud. And now in roughly the year 500 or so, we segue into the Geonim, to the geniuses. And that's the rabbinic leadership for the next 500 years. Now, the Geonim they were always the Rosh Hashiva of one of the two major academies, in either Sura and Pumbedisa. For the most part, it was a consensus as to which one was greater, and he would be the Rosh Hashiva. As we'll see, there were sometimes disputes as to who the Gaon should be, because, hey, we're Jews. But that was really the religious leader. Now, there was the provincial leader of the Jewish community, as we mentioned before, the Reish Galusa, the exilarch, the head of the exile. And that was really a government position. It was often, usually, at least for many centuries, was a descendant of the house of David. The idea is that would be the heir apparent if the redemption, or when the redemption will come. But that was the provincial leader. Now, the relationship between the Gaon and the Reish Galusa varied. It really varied based on who was Gaon and who was Reish Galusa. And sometimes they got along and they worked in sync. And a lot of times the Reish Galusa was also a great scholar and a very pious person. And unfortunately, sometimes not. and we'll see some of those time periods also. But those are our two main leadership roles that we have for the Jewish community in Babylon. We have the Gaon, the rabbis, and we have the Reish Galusa, the exilarch. Now, it's interesting to point out, the exilarch always had to be approved. Once the Muslims take over, the exilarch is actually a position of the caliphate. It's appointed technically by the caliph, who's a Muslim leader in the area. The caliph of Baghdad is the one we're dealing with, because that's the area of the world we're in. And he would usually take recommendations of the Jewish community and then appoint the Reish Galusa. But it was considered a government position, full status government position, as we will see. Now, it's interesting that when we look at the time period of the Gaonim, the rabbinic time period of Gaonim as a snapshot, it's a little bit of a hard time period for us to understand, because while we know many of the names, places, dates, we know they're in Babylon, either in Sura and Pumbedisa were the main towns, and we got the general details. We don't have, with the exception of a few, we don't have a lot of writings from the Gaonim, but we have them mentioned heavily in the subsequent set of really prolific rabbinic literature they're going to have from what we call the Rishonim, Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, the Balei Tosos, etc., which we'll get to in the coming days. We'll have the Gaonim mentioned quite often. And it's just kind of interesting that while the concept of the Gaonim and different Gaonim, especially in Tosos, are mentioned prolifically, just we have very little preserved of the actual writings. What's interesting, though, is we have a concept that comes up quite often in halacha called Tikanos HaGaonim, which means the laws that the Gaonim establish. Because what we do see from this time period, now this is, again, it's stuff usually mentioned in Rambam, Rashi, the Balei Tosfos, so the commentaries of the next generation, but it seems that they look back to the previous generation and look at a lot of things that they fixed, if you will, a lot of enactments that they put into place. Many of them had to do with civil law, because, as we said, the Jews had provincial freedom in Babylon, so Jewish civil law applied. But some of them are very familiar to us even to this day. And some examples are that the Pidyon Ben, the concept of the redemption of the firstborn by the Kohen, that's a biblical commandment, but the service that we have until this very day was written by the Gaonim, was one of the Tikanos HaGaonim. When we say the Amida during the 10 days of repentance, and we add in those four special lines, Zachrenu L'chaim, El Chavitz B'chaim, and B'Sefer Chaim, Bracha V'Shalom, Parnas, all those things, Mi Kamcha Yisrael, Mi Kumelcha Avrachamim, etc. Those four additions we put into our Amida during the 10 days, starting with Rosh Hashanah and ending with Yom Kippur, that's from the Gaonim. Again, the Amida was already probably close to 1,000 years old at this point. But those additions for the high holidays were put in for by the Gaonim. Another thing that's very famous is they prohibited oath-taking. Oath-taking used to be a very big deal in the Jewish world with the name of God, and that's why you see, again, come the high holidays, we focus so much on getting rid of these oaths, Hatars Nadarim, Kol Nidre, etc. The Geonim said no more oath-taking. In other words, the courts, the rabbis, the leadership should not require people to take oaths using the name of the Almighty. And one last thing that's very familiar to us, unfortunately, is the get. Now, the concept of the get, again, is in the Torah, it's in the Mishnah, it's in the Gemara, but the what we would call the set nusach we have for the get, which is used until this very day, was established by the Geonim. So the get, the process of get that we have today was established by the Geonim. So a number of other things, but these are some of the famous ones. I saw in a book that I like to use to prepare that quite often you'll hear the concept of Jews not eating kitnios, not eating legumes on Pesach as a takana of the Gaonim, but it probably came in the next generation, and we'll get to that when we, maybe next week or in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But it was not from the Gaonim. One of the main reasons we know it wasn't from the Gaonim is because what will become the Sephardic community was very much tied to the Babylonian community and offshoot of the Babylonian community, and the Sephardim don't, they eat kitnios in Pesach, so it can't be that the Gaonim established it. Came later, it was Ashkenazim later, Vichil Peres, the Balei Tosfos, that's probably where the custom of not eating kitnios for Ashkenazim on Pesach came from. Okay, so that's the Gaonim, that's the snapshot of rabbinic leadership. We're going to focus in on one major of the Gaonim tonight, and in coming sessions probably touch on a few more, but that's the structure of the Jews in Babylon this time, under Muslim rule, but luckily it's a benevolent Muslim rule. Okay, there's two communities I wanted to focus on tonight. One is it's a very interesting Jewish community because many will debate if they in fact existed or if they were a legend. Predominant view in amongst historians, and for sure Jewish historians, is that they for sure existed, and the general knowledge that we have of these people is accurate. Again, details we're limited on, but I'm referring to the people of the Khazars, or the Khazars. Now, you might have heard of them because I think people often associate them with Kazakhstan. No real relationship, except that's probably, Kazakhstan's a big country, but probably the westernmost part of the country was part of their empire. But where they really became famous is in about, if we would fast forward when we get to Spanish Jewry in a few weeks, and a very famous rabbi by the name of Rav Yehuda Levi, who wrote a philosophical work known as the Kuzari. And the philosophical work is loosely based on the historical story of the Khazars. Now, I'll tell the story that he bases on, and that's really what we assume, again, some level was what happened. Now, the main place we know the details of the nation of the Khazars was that there are some communications that existed back and forth between Jews in Spain and the kingdom of the Khazars, and they tell about how they became Jewish and what they do, and etc. So let's just instead of talking about it, let's jump into it. And who are the Khazars? Or Khazars is probably the proper pronunciation. So the kingdom of the Khazars probably surfaced somewhere, at least became Jewish somewhere in the mid-8th century. Now, they were, before they became Jewish, they were known as a pretty powerful nation. They were fierce warriors, and many give them credit for putting a stop to the Muslim conquest in the East. We mentioned Charles Martel, the Battle of Tours, and in Vienna. In France, where the Muslims were stopped in Western Europe. There are many who give credit to the Khazars for stopping them in Eastern Europe. And the Khazars seem to have been a people that were monotheist at some level, but they were searching for what to do. And the way that Rabbi Yehuda Levi tells the story is that the king was searching for the truth, and he brought a Muslim cleric, he brought a rabbi, and he brought a priest to each have a debate, not necessarily with each other, but each present their case. And in the end, he decided Judaism was, in fact, the true religion. And as we've discussed many times in antiquity, if your king converts to a new religion, that usually means the whole nation is following. So some sort of story like this probably happened, and the king converts, everyone else followed. There are, again, different theories and thoughts. There might have been other Jewish influence in the area. There might have been Jews running away from the Muslims who came to the area and had an influence. Be it as it may, we know that by the mid-8th century, the nation of the Khazars is a Jewish nation, which is really fascinating if you think about it, because we're already at this point about 700 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. We have the Jews in Babylon with a certain amount of freedom, but definitely not what we would consider nationhood. And now we have our first, I think our only on the map of world history, Jewish nation that's just somewhere else in the world. and that's where it is. And the area of the world that we're talking about for the Khazars is modern-day Georgia, Azerbaijan, a little bit of Kazakhstan, that area in the former Soviet Union between the Black and the Caspian Sea. And it was a Jewish nation that probably existed as a Jewish nation for about 200 years strong. Eventually, because this is still a time of great war and great conquest, they will be dismantled as a nation. Either they'll just spread out in the diaspora, or parts of them will be first forcibly converted to Islam. But roughly by the end of the 10th century, the Khazars are gone. But they do maintain a very interesting place just in Jewish psyche, Jewish folklore, that for about 200 years or so there was a Jewish nation in the Caucasus and the former Soviet Union, and it was a completely Jewish nation, an observant Jewish nation, and unfortunately they didn't stand the test of time, but they, like I said, the predominant opinion of historians, they did exist, and they did in fact convert Judaism, and the story is accurate. And that was right at this time. Okay, now let's focus in on a group of people that were really a force to be reckoned with in the Jewish world for several hundred years. And the background to this group focuses back in on what we were talking about before, sometimes the leadership struggles that would happen in Babylon, how sometimes we had good Reish Galusas, sometimes we had not so good Reish Galusas. But the backdrop is we find ourselves roughly in the 8th century, around 763 to be exact. And even though the Jews had it really good in Babylon, what we see today in the Jewish world in 2022, we think, oh, it's so crazy. You got about a third of the Jewish world that's Torah observant, and you have another third that's either Reform or conservative, and you have another third that is completely not interested in anything, and it's such a terrible state. In truth, it's kind of the norm. That's almost how it always was. So we think somehow that our experience is unique. But if you've been paying attention to the Jewish Destiny series, you know it's not unique. That really, from the time of Moshe, there's always been dissenting groups, and it's always been a challenge. There's always been the group that represents Torah's Moshe, the tradition of Moshe, and there's always groups to challenge that in every generation. And I always like to point out that one of the havtachas, the guarantees that Moshe gives before the end of his life is that the Jewish people will exist forever, but it'll be those who stick with the Torah of Moshe who exist forever. So while we see a lot of these groups gain a lot of power and a lot of influence, and we've talked about a lot of those groups, they usually don't last more than a generation or two, maybe sometimes 100 years or two, and then they just fizzle out because in the end, they don't have the guarantee of Moshe that if you stick with the Torah, you will exist. Though the small group of today, what is it, 2 million Jews throughout history, it's probably waxed and waned in numbers, but those who stay true to Torah's Moshe, to the Torah and the tradition of Moshe, those are the ones who have the guarantee of existing throughout all of history. So anyhow, Babylon at this point, circa 8th century, was no different. There are many disgruntled groups. They're probably leftovers of our friends the Sadducees that we discussed several sessions ago, and we're going to see that those groups are going to start to unite in a powerful way. Now, who do they unite around? Here's what happens. So there's the Reish Galusa, the head of the community at this point, is a man by the name of Shlomo ben Chastai. Now, Shlomo ben Chastai dies childless. So in general, the Reish Galusa, when possible, was dynastic. It did stay within families. As we said, they would try to keep it in the house of David. Different offshoots at this point because we're so far down the line. But Shlomo ben Chasai dies childless. Now, he has two nephews. One whose name is Anan, and one whose name is Hananya. Now, Anan was the clear front runner. He was more charismatic. He was a little bit of a scholar. It would seem on paper that he should have been the one who should have taken over for his uncle. There was only one problem, that, as we mentioned, that strife that would wax and wane between the Geonim, the rabbis, and the Reish Galusa. The rabbis felt that he was a little too talented, and it wouldn't be so good to have this man as the Reish Galusa. So after Shlomo ben Chastai dies, the Gaonim, the rabbis, they go to the Caliph of Baghdad, and they lobby him to appoint the younger brother, Hananya, and by the way, in the Arabic world, when we talk about lobby, just read bribe, all right? So they bribe the Caliph of Baghdad to appoint Hananya as the Reish Galusa, and Hananya becomes the Reish Galusa. Now, Anan, being the type of wildy guy that he was, as we'll see, was not going to take this monumental snub lying down. So he basically starts to gather together all these different disgruntled groups throughout Babylon, starts to form a movement, and he says, Ich bin the Reish Galusa. In other words, my brother's not the Reish Galusa, I'm the Reish Galusa. But that was, kind of nice on paper for him to do such thing. There was only one serious problem. Like, you would think, okay, he's gonna perform a coup. He's gonna get enough people to follow him. He'll say he's Reish Galusa. Eventually he'll get it. The only problem is, as we mentioned before, the position of Reish Galusa was considered a government position. It was appointed by the caliphate. And therefore, he wasn't just trying to rally support so that he could run next time for Reish Galusa. He was going against the Caliph of Baghdad. And therefore, it wasn't just, not smart, it was treason. So sure enough, the Caliph and his officers find out about what Anan is doing. They have him arrested. They have him sentenced to death on treason, and he is thrown into jail to await his final trial before he's sentenced to death. And you might think, okay, that's the end of Anan ben David. He tried, and he's gone from history. The only problem is, as legend goes, when he is in jail, he's obviously in some sort of jail for political prisoners or religious prisoners maybe, he meets a man by the name of Abu Hanifa. Now, Abu Hanifa, you might know his name if you know anything about Islam besides what we've discussed before, but he becomes the head of the school of the Hanafites, which is a sort of a break-off philosophy of Sunni Islam that exists until today. And he was arrested on similar charges. He was, through his new philosophies in school and teaching, etc., was sort of challenging the Muslim establishment. So as Anan and Abu Hanifa are talking in jail about their plights and their cases and how they're going to deal with it. Abu Hanifa gives Anan a piece of advice. He says, when you go before the courts, don't try to say you were snubbed, you deserve to be Reish Galusa, you deserve the position, your brother didn't deserve it. No, that's not going to work. You should go in and say, I have a different belief set. I have a different religion. They follow the rabbis. We follow me. And you can take all your disgruntled groups and present a new philosophy and just say, we're a different religion. So yeah, my brother, Hananya, he's the Reish Galusa of the Jewish community. I'm the Reish Galusa of what becomes known as the Ananites. And he does this. And sure enough, the plea is accepted, and he is let out of jail to basically take his movement and flourish with it. So during his lifetime, they are called the Ananites, based on his name, Anan. And this is what his philosophy is based on. He claimed at one point to have a vision, that he was visited by none other than Eliyahu Navi, than Elijah the prophet, who told him that the rabbinical Jews are doing it all wrong. They totally messed things up from the way the Torah was given on Sinai. They're following it wrong. This thing about lo savasha gedi b'chalav don't cook a kid in his mother's milk, means don't have a cheese. No, they just got it all wrong. And he said, you have to go to the world and point out everywhere where they got it wrong. So similar to the Sadducees who came before him and were probably involved with him at this point, he renounced or denounced the Torah Shebaal Peh, the tradition of now, which was not only an oral tradition, but we have the whole Talmud now. We have the Talmud prolificated throughout the whole Jewish world. It's much more organized now, but he says that's all not right. Yes, it's been the tradition for, at this point, hundreds of thousands of years. Eliyahu Navi told me they got it wrong, so I'm going to tell you the new approach. And he basically attempts to rewrite the whole entire Torah because, as we always say, the Torah on its own is incomprehensible. You can never figure out how to be a Jew by just opening up the 5 books of Moses and reading. Not only that, but the Torah scroll is incomprehensible because it doesn't even have the vowels, and many words, depending on how you put the vowels under them, will have different meanings. But so basically, he makes up his own Torah Shebaal Peh, his own interpretation of the Torah, and he writes a book called Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of Commandments, which lays out his philosophy. Now, even though he was a forceful personality, he had a following, he does make one, bad for business mistake. And that is, his general approach to Judaism is to be frummer than the rabbis, to be more religious than the rabbis. And I'll give you some examples that he totally rejects the concept of minimum measurements of prohibitions. Like, for example, the idea of nullifying 1 in 60, or the idea of when we talk about if someone eats something prohibited, it has to be a certain amount. He said any amount is a problem. And another interesting thing that he prohibits is he said that all meat is forbidden because we don't have a temple, we don't have an altar, we don't bring offerings, and the only way to eat meat is through offerings. So therefore, the only meat that he ate was venison, because venison is a kosher meat that there wasn't an offering for. So he only allowed the eating of venison, which I don't know if venison was more common in Baghdad than it is in Cleveland, but that's what he allowed. One of the other things is he did not allow anyone to leave their house on Shabbos. When we get into the concept of tchumim and going out of your boundaries and all this on Shabbos, he understood that to mean you couldn't leave your house. And not only that, but when it says in the Torah, Lo savar reish b'chol b'yom Shabbos, that you can't light a fire in your house the whole Shabbos, he was of the opinion that meant the whole Shabbos. So you can imagine for him, like for us, Shabbos is such an enjoyable time. We have delicious food. We spend time with our family. We all look forward to it. For him, it was this cold, dark, dank place where you could go and even the really frum ones amongst them would just sit in their chairs and would not even get up from their place. That's how I understood. Don't even get up from your place. Now, it's interesting to point out that the Baal Ma'or, one of the latter commentaries, says that that a Jew has to have hot food on Shabbos. Cholent, basically, which is food that we leave on the fire from before Shabbos, and then we eat it Shabbos morning. He says if a Jew doesn't eat cholent on Shabbos, you have to look into his lineage that he might be a Karaite. Okay, if you don't like cholent, it could be a hot tea, but the idea is we utilize heat or fire in a permissible way on Shabbos, with fires lit from before Shabbos, with food put on the fire from before Shabbos, etc. That's not what the Karaites did. He said matzah could only come from barley, and many, many more things that were more strict than the rabbis. Now, because he makes that mistake of going frummer as opposed to going less frum, it's always better for business and religion to go more lenient, to go more stringent, usually. But you would think that it would just die out pretty quickly. And what happens is after he dies, his followers, with the permission of the caliphate, move to Jerusalem and kind of die out there. But the disgruntledness that he had spread and the disgruntled groups that he had brought together, well, they're still all about this idea of challenging the rabbis and making their own group. And they take the ideas of Anan ben David and kind of make them a little more palatable, a little more light, less aesthetic, and make it more user-friendly, if you will. And after his death, the movement, so to speak, spreads like wildfire. Now, according to some historians, it could be up to 40% of the Jewish world becomes Karaite, or at least up to 40% of what we'll call the Sephardic world will become Karaite. It's definitely a force to reckon with, definitely in places like Baghdad, Egypt. We see in Israel there's a presence, and it's really a force to be reckoned with. Now, they would have probably had a more longer lasting influence on the Jewish people if it wasn't for two giants who come along and essentially stem the tide of Karaitism. One is a rabbi by the name of Saadia Gaon, and the other is the Rambam. Now, Saadia Gaon is at this time in the 10th century, and we're going to see he's first in Egypt, and then he goes to Babylon. He's actually in Egypt, Israel, and then Babylon. So he interacts with the Karaites in all places, and he'll die in the year 942. But then, if we fast forward about 150 years or so, when Maimonides the Rambam is going to come back to Egypt, he's going to still find Egypt to be a major Karaite community, and we're going to see that that's going to be about the last major Karaite community at that point, and he's going to do the final Shalom Chaver to the Karaites at that time. But we'll get to that when we get to the Rambam. Let's focus now on Saadia Gaon. But before that, just interesting to think about the numbers. We're saying that up to 40% of the Jewish world at this time was probably Karaite, and today they're almost non-existent. There are about 30,000 maybe Karaites left in the world today that descend somehow from these different groups. They are all concentrated in either Chalon in Israel, and the old city of Jerusalem, there's a small Karaite synagogue, and in San Francisco, there's a small Karaite synagogue. But then again, there's a synagogue for everything in San Francisco, so it makes sense that it would be there. But a group that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, maybe up to the millions at some point, is probably going to be gone within a few generations, less than 30,000 at this point. And the first person we really have to thank is Saadia Gaon. So who is Saadia Gaon? Saadia Gaon was actually born in Egypt, and he was born in Egypt in the year 882. And from a young age, he was known as really in many ways a Renaissance man. Not only was he a great Torah scholar, but he was a very prolific writer. He wrote all areas of Jewish law. He wrote poems, Jewish poems. He actually he's a prolific rabbinical writer. He translates the Torah and much of the prophets into Arabic, which like the first art scroll of its time. So the Jews who only spoke Arabic could relate to the Torah. And one of the things he is really the most famous for is he writes numerous polemics. Going back to probably as young as 21 years old when we believe he wrote his first polemic, and it was actually against the Karaites. He did not like the rise of Karaitism. Again, this is roughly, let's say this is 100 years after Anan ben David. This is in Egypt. And he did not like the rise of Karaitism that he was seeing as a 21-year-old scholar, Renaissance man in Egypt. So he wrote his very first polemic against the Karaites in Egypt at that time. Now, in those days, a polemic really worked. We don't think about polemics working so much anymore because most people don't know how to read, but by polemic we mean a pamphlet. We mean writing articles against things. But they're really, up until modern times, there's a tremendous amount of influence that was yielded and that was given over by way of writing, by way of these polemics, of articles, of pamphlets. And we see that a lot of the success that Saadia Gaon had was through the pen, was through his his different pamphlets and polemics that he would write when he would have these different struggles. So his first polemic that we have is against the Karaites at the age of, when he was 21 years old in Egypt. He eventually moves to Israel. And there he meets some more descendants of Anan ben David. The battle continues. He continues to write. He continues to fight with the Karaites. That all keeps going on, and it's a fight he wages his entire life. We're going to see that one of his most monumental works has a little bit of an influence on this that we'll get to in a moment. But now we see that he has a second major, we'll call it a fight, with a man by the name of Aaron ben Meir. Now it's interesting because we mentioned how the presence of the Jews in Israel has pretty much been stomped out now at this point for over 500 years. But we also mentioned that at no point in Jewish history were there no Jews in Israel. There are always small communities. There are always attempts to go back, and we'll see, especially after the Spanish expulsion, will be when what we're living through now, the culmination of which we're living through now. But even in between that, we're going to see there's always small pockets of Jewish presence in Israel. And because it's Israel, there are those who think that even though they don't have numbers, even though they don't have necessarily the scholarship, even though they don't have everything that in this case is going on in Babylon, well, it's Israel, so there should be a certain amount of supremacy there. And that argument we're going to see is going to last until modern times. Now the argument is switching a little bit because the numbers are there and the rabbinical leadership is there and the rabbinical scholarship is there. But we're going to see at even the time of the founding of the state of Israel and on through the first few decades of the modern state of Israel, that's still going to be an issue of this sort of this idea that Israel should have supremacy even without the scholarship and the numbers and everything else. So that for sure is going on at this time. So the leader in Israel is this rabbi by the name of Aaron ben Meir. And we have a struggle that breaks out. And that is that the Babylonian Jewish community, which is, majority rules, has the calendar the way that they've maintained it from the small hill that we talked about a number of weeks ago. And there's a discrepancy between the Babylonian calendar and the Israeli calendar. And the struggle going back and forth is that the Babylonians say, 90+% of the Jewish people are here in Babylon. We have the great yeshivas, we have the Gaon, we have everything. Our calendar rules. And Aaron ben Meir says, okay, I might not have numbers, I might not have scholarship, but I have Israel. And there's a concept that we talked about before of Rosh Chodesh always having to be based in Israel. So he thinks his calendar should rule. Now, again, let's take a step back for a minute and understand the struggle. In the Jewish world, our calendar is everything. And luckily now with butcher shops and apps and everything, there's no question about a unified Jewish calendar. But you can imagine, and this is not the first time in Jewish history this has sprouted a question in the calendar. Might have been the last one, but you can imagine what happened if you have, let's say, you have the Babylonian community, 90+% of the Jewish world. Okay, Yom Kippur's on a Tuesday, and you have this small community in Israel saying it's on a Wednesday. And it might be one day off this year, but the ultimate divide that could cause in the Jewish calendar. There's the general concept of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We believe in watching out for that in the Jewish world in a major way, especially because we see that a small crack today can lead to a big canyon down the road. So the rabbinic leadership, the Geonim in Babylon, rightfully saw the calendar and the steadfastness of Ben Meir as a problem, that he really needed to submit himself to the Babylonian calendar, and it was going to be a problem. And they actually employed Saadia Gaon to be their go-between, to be the one to try and see if they could massage the whole situation out. Now, Saadia Gaon essentially tries to do it with honey. He tries to, talk to Aaron ben Meir. He tries to rationalize with him. He tries to explain to him the difficulties in the Jewish world of their two calendars and how, from everything that we see, Babylon is supreme right now, etc., etc. And ben Meir was having none of it. So when it doesn't work with honey, that's when Saadia Gaon gives him a tongue lashing like you wouldn't believe, again, through the pen. And he starts writing polemics against Ben Meir, explaining why he's wrong, explaining why the Babylonian community is correct. And pretty soon, Ben Meir becomes completely isolated, and it is clear that his calendar is just going to be his personal calendar, and the Babylonian community will remain supreme, and the potential chasm between the small community in Israel and the rest of the Jewish world is averted by Saadia Gaon. Now, eventually, Saadia Gaon is, in the year 928, is actually appointed as Gaon. That's what we call him, Saadia Gaon. He is the Rosh Yeshiva, he's the head of the academy in Surah, and he's appointed to the position of Gaon. And he now is actually the first imported Gaon, because every other Gaon that came before him was sort of homegrown in Babylon. And as we mentioned, Saadia Gaon came from Egypt originally. Now, he is an impeccable person in many ways, and he actually gets into a little bit of a skirmish with the Reish Galusa, whose name is David ben Zakkai, who wants Saadia Gaon to side with him on a certain monetary case that he had. Saadia Gaon heard the case fairly and didn't give any unfair treatment to bolster the case of David ben Zakkai. And as we always know, that when somebody says it's not about the money, it's always about the money. And a big fight breaks out between David ben Zakkai, the Reish Galusa, and Saadia Gaon. And so eventually Saadia Gaon steps down as as the Gaon. The fight eventually comes down. He goes back the last few years of his life, and he is really regarded as the greatest of all of the Geonim. Now, he's not only regarded as the greatest because the way that he fought the Karaites, the way that he kept the Jewish world together at the great calendar debacle, but it's really his prolific writings, many of which we still have today. We have a lot of those polemics. We have a lot of his Arabic writings, but really the most famous of his writings is a book that he published in the year 933, a book called Emunah Videos, which means faith and ideas. And this book is the very first systematic book of Jewish philosophy ever. Now, when you study the Talmud and Midrashim and the Zohar, there's a lot of philosophy there, right? Judaism definitely has its fair share of philosophical ideas. But until this point, none of it is systematically organized. And we're going to see that this is going to be, again, a process that will exist unto this very day of the systematic writing down and studying of what we call Machshava and eventually Kabbalah. And it really starts with this book of Emunah Videos. Now, why did he write Emunah Videos? Two main reasons. Number one is the Muslim world was very into philosophy. So many Jews were being influenced by the Muslim philosophy and the idea of philosophy. So Rav Saadia Gaon said, we'll write our own philosophy. We don't need their philosophy. I'll write you our own philosophy. And that was probably one influence in writing this book. And the other one was the Karaites. He wanted to make sure that all of classic rabbinic tradition that had been passed down from Moses until this day, that we had the Talmud, that wrote a lot of it down, but that we had an organized way, just one book, you could go and open and read the philosophies, understand where Judaism is coming from, and there would be no questions. So it was likely in part the Muslim influence and in part his ongoing battle with the Karaites. And like I said, Saadia was one of the greatest of the Geonim, and we have these writings unto this very day. And that's really a snapshot of the time period of the Geonim. When we continue next time, we will discuss the waning of this time period and really the end of the focus on Babylon. Now, Babylon's going to be a Jewish community until 1952, after the founding of the State of Israel, when the Jews of Iraq are going to be kicked out. But from roughly the year 1000 until 1952, it's no longer really the center of the Jewish world. And we're going to see the center shift into what we know as the Sephardic world in North Africa and in Spain, and the Ashkenazi world in France, in England, and Germany. And in the coming weeks, that's what we'll talk about, how that sort of split happens between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and how and how it really exists unto this very day. And I look forward to having that discussion with you in the coming weeks. Next week, we will be off. There will be no Jewish Destiny series next week, as I will be traveling with my family for our winter break. And God willing, we will continue after that with really the split scene of the Jewish world, of the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi world. I thank you all for coming, and I thank you for listening.